I remember the day Gary showed up like it was yesterday. A polished man in a suit that looked tailored specifically to intimidate. He knocked exactly 3 times, sharp and forceful, on the door of my little small house. I was trying to fix a leaky faucet covered in rust-colored water, and I opened the door holding a wrench, completely unprepared for the earthquake he was about to set off in my life. "Mr. Ethan Kincaid?" he asked, his voice low and smooth, like expensive scotch. "That's me," I said, wiping my hand on my jeans, instantly feeling like the least important person in the county. The small house was exactly what it sounded like, a dilapidated, 700-square-foot relic perched on the edge of the rapidly gentrifying Willow Creek neighborhood. I bought it 3 years ago, a spontaneous, desperate investment after a bad breakup and an even worse stock market dive. I'd sunk every last penny into it, plus a hefty mortgage. The house itself was a nightmare, but the lot, a generous, strangely shaped third of an acre, was the real asset, though I didn't truly grasp how valuable until Gary arrived. Gary didn't waste time on pleasantries. He sidestepped the issue of the wrench in my hand and got straight to the point, pulling a crisp, legal-looking envelope from his inner jacket pocket. "I represent an interested party," he began, not even bothering to look past the threshold into the mess I called home. "We are prepared to make an aggressive, non-negotiable cash offer for this property, specifically the land." I'd received junk offers before, investors testing the water, sensing the neighborhood shift. They were usually lowball, insulting proposals I tossed straight into the recycling. I was about to dismiss Gary when he named the price. $1.2 million, he said. Just like that, $1.2 million. My jaw must have dropped. I stammered. I bought this place for $350,000 3 years ago. The assessed value is barely $500,000 even now. I was trying to sound professional, but the number was echoing in my head, drowning out the logical part of my brain. $1.2 million was 4 times what I'd paid, and more than twice what it was realistically worth on the open market, given the house was basically falling apart. Gary offered a tight, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Our client is prepared to expedite the sale. We understand the value of speed in this market. This offer is only valid for 24 hours. 24 hours. It was a pressure tactic, pure and simple. But the sheer size of the offer made the pressure almost irresistible. $1.2 million. Enough to pay off my mortgage, pay off my debts, and have a solid $500,000 left over. It was a lifeline, a restart button I desperately needed. "Why the rush?" I managed, finally leaning the wrench against the doorframe. "The client has specific development deadlines," Gary replied vaguely. "And the offer is structured to compensate you handsomely for the inconvenience of a rapid relocation. If we don't have a signed agreement by 5 p.m. tomorrow, the offer is retracted completely, and you will not receive another communication from us." He handed me the envelope, which contained a 1-page summary and proof of funds from a prestigious yet unfamiliar holding company. The name of the interested party was redacted, classic high-roller maneuvering. Gary gave me his card, told me to call him before the deadline, and walked back to his black town car, idling discreetly down the street. The whole encounter took less than 5 minutes. I closed the door and just stared at the envelope. $1.2 million. It was overwhelming. I felt a surge of pure, selfish relief, the kind that makes your hands shake. I didn't need to fix the faucet. I could hire 10 plumbers. I could leave this dump behind. The next few hours were a whirlwind of frantic calls. I reached out to my friend Maria, a real estate lawyer, and explained the situation. 24 hours, Ethan? That's insane, she said, her voice tight with professional suspicion. It's an aggressive move. They're trying to prevent a bidding war. But Maria, the price is already 4 times what I paid. What kind of bidding war could push it higher? The kind where the property has a hidden value, she countered, her lawyer brain already spinning. Look, I can review the documents, but you have to understand, if they're offering this much, they want something specific, something unique to your lot. It's not just the square footage. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my tiny living room, looking out the back window at the overgrown backyard. The backyard was the lot's defining feature, deep, wide, and backing directly onto a high, imposing stone wall that separated my humble property from the colossal, sprawling estate of the neighborhood's undisputed king, Silas Thorne. Silas Thorne. He was the local legend, the man who made his fortune inventing some kind of obscure but critical semiconductor component. He lived in the largest house in Willow Creek, a veritable fortress surrounded by high walls, lush landscaping, and an aura of untouchable wealth. His property was rumored to be 10 acres of pristine, exclusive land. It hit me then, a cold, unsettling realization. My property's value wasn't the house, or even the lot itself, but the adjacency to Silas Thorne's estate. But why would Silas Thorne, with his 10 acres, want my tiny backyard? It didn't make sense. His property seemed vast enough already. Maybe the buyer was just an investor who wanted to build a luxury condo next door to Thorne, thinking the proximity alone would skyrocket the unit's value. The next morning, with the 5 p.m. deadline looming, I drove to Maria's office. She had reviewed the documents and found them legally sound, if highly restrictive. The only red flag, she noted, is the extreme confidentiality and the speed requirement. They want you out fast, and they don't want anyone else knowing the true purchaser or the true purpose until the ink is dry. I had two choices: sign the agreement and become a millionaire, or dig deeper and risk losing everything on a hunch. The ethical side of me screamed to investigate, but the financially desperate side was already picturing the wire transfer. "Maria," I said, "I need to know who the buyer is, or at least who the property next door belongs to." "We know who the property next door belongs to," Maria said, looking concerned. "The stone wall is the boundary. It's Silas Thorne's estate." I rubbed my temples. "I know, but why my backyard? Why the desperate rush? If they really wanted it, they could have offered this a year ago." Maria shrugged. "Maybe they just realized they needed it." As I left Maria's office, I had 5 hours left. The money was tempting, almost paralyzing. But the 24-hour deadline had activated a deep, rebellious suspicion in me. Nobody offers $1.2 million for $350,000 worth of property unless they stand to make $12 million. I had to know what I was truly selling. I decided I needed to see Thorne's property from a different angle, from the perspective of someone who needed more space. I pulled out my phone and searched for high-resolution aerial photos of Silas Thorne's estate. The satellite images were publicly available, but rarely viewed. I zoomed in, tracing the immaculate boundary line, the massive stone wall that ran between his property and mine. His estate was a beautiful geometric sprawl of manicured lawns, a giant main house, a tennis court, and an enormous L-shaped swimming pool complex. And then I saw it. It wasn't directly adjacent to the main house. It was near the far corner of the estate, tucked behind the pool complex. There was a section of his property, a surprisingly small, rectangular patch of land that looked oddly unused. Then I looked at my backyard again, and a cold dread washed over me. My property wasn't just next to his. My backyard, the generous, strangely shaped third of an acre, was the missing piece to a perfect puzzle. The small house lot was shaped like a key, and Thorne's estate was the lock. Specifically, the unused patch on Thorne's side, when combined with my backyard, created a long, smooth, perfectly situated strip of land. A strip of land exactly the size and shape needed for something massive, something requiring a specific orientation, like a private, small helipad, or perhaps an underground extension tunnel leading away from the house. I looked at the clock. 3 p.m. 2 hours left. I knew then that Gary wasn't just representing a vague client. He was representing Silas Thorne, and the $1.2 million was not a massive overpayment. It was a cheap way to secure an absolutely critical piece of infrastructure before I figured out its true strategic value. I had to find out what Thorne needed that specific strip of land for, and I needed to do it in 2 hours. I slammed my laptop shut. The satellite image was burned into my retina. It wasn't about a helipad or a tunnel. It was about geometry. My small, oddly shaped parcel was the critical hinge that allowed Thorne's vast property to achieve a perfect, contiguous square, allowing for whatever massive construction project he was planning. The $1.2 million was bait. If that land was truly critical to a multi-million-dollar development, or more likely, $100 million estate expansion, then my small house was worth far, far more. I drove back to the small house, my mind racing. 2 hours until the deadline. I knew I couldn't just call Gary and demand more money based on a hunch from Google Maps. He'd laugh and pull the offer. I needed concrete evidence of what Thorne planned to build. I needed to see past the high stone wall. I put on a worn hoodie and a pair of old work boots. This wasn't a time for subtlety. It was time for reconnaissance. The back of my property, the area directly adjacent to Thorne's wall, was completely overgrown. A dense tangle of thorny bushes, wild vines, and thick, stubborn weeds. It was a natural barrier, and one I had ignored for 3 years. I grabbed my heavy-duty garden shears and started hacking away at the vegetation near the wall, focusing on the corner where my lot met Thorne's. It was painstaking work, full of scraping branches and buzzing mosquitoes. I wasn't just clearing the brush. I was looking for any weakness, any hint of what lay on the other side. The stone wall was impressive, at least 10 feet high, topped with electric wire, and built of thick, dark granite blocks. It was designed to keep people out, and clearly, to hide everything within. As I got closer to the corner, I noticed something strange. While the rest of the wall was uniform and seamless, at the exact point where my yard formed the key shape, there was a small section, perhaps 6 feet wide, that looked newer. The mortar was a slightly different shade, and the stones, though clearly the same type of granite, were set with an unnerving precision. It was too neat, too recently finished. I pressed my ear against the cool stone. Nothing but the faint hum of power lines. Then, a low, rhythmic vibration. Thump, 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 thump. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like heavy machinery running deep underground. This was the evidence Maria needed. Thorne wasn't just planning to build. He was already building. And the construction had to be happening right up against that boundary, likely beneath the surface, meaning my land was critical not just for expansion, but perhaps for access or ventilation. My paranoia spiked. Why the secrecy? If it was just a regular pool house or gym, why the 24-hour pressure and the intense confidentiality? I pulled out my phone again and tried a different search. Silas Thorne construction permits. Willow Creek was notoriously lax with minor residential permits, but anything involving deep excavation usually required public filing. I found nothing for the main estate. It was a dead end. Thorne was operating in the shadows, or perhaps using a loophole designed for extremely wealthy individuals, like getting the city to classify the work as interior renovation, despite its scale. I called Maria. "The wall is the key," I whispered, feeling ridiculous but serious. "There's fresh construction near the boundary. I can feel the vibration, and there's a patch of newer mortar right at the corner of my property. He's building something big, and he needs my land to finish it, or maybe even to access it." Maria sounded agitated. "Ethan, the deadline is an hour and a half away. Do you have a plan?" "I'm not signing for $1.2 million. I'm going to leverage this. Call Gary. Tell him I'm interested, but the 24-hour deadline is insulting for a parcel of land adjacent to a major, unpermitted construction project. Tell him I know his client is Silas Thorne and that I'm willing to talk, but the price has increased significantly. Don't name a number yet, just establish that I hold the cards now. That's a huge risk, Ethan. If he pulls the offer, you're back to square one, with a leaky faucet and a $350K house. And if I sign now, I'll be watching a multi-million-dollar structure rise in my backyard for the rest of my life, knowing I let them steal my asset for peanuts. I'm not taking the easy out this time, Maria. I'm fighting." Maria reluctantly agreed, promising to call Gary and buy me some time, even if it was just 5 minutes of frantic negotiation. I hung up and paced. I had to assume the first offer was around 10% of the land's true value to Thorne. If the construction was truly critical, the value wasn't about the area, but about the stop-work power I possessed. I looked at the house one last time. It was a dump, but it was my dump, and for the first time it felt powerful. I wasn't just a broke guy fixing a faucet. I was the bottleneck for a titan of industry. Minutes later, my phone rang. It was Maria. "Gary is furious," she breathed, clearly stressed. He didn't confirm the client, of course, but his composure slipped. He said the price change was outrageous and unrealistic. I just kept repeating, my client is now aware of the strategic value of the lot. He said he'd call me back, but he didn't promise the offer would still be on the table. Good, I said, my heart pounding. That means they need it more than they want to intimidate me. Now, here's the twist. The real leverage. I need you to search public records, not for Thorne's house, but for his neighbor. Maria sounded utterly confused. His neighbor? Ethan, you are his neighbor. No, I mean the property on the other side of his estate. The property bordering his north boundary. The one furthest from me. I have a sudden, terrible feeling about that corner. I wasn't sure why I focused on the other neighbor. Maybe it was the sheer scope of Thorne's greed, or the way the satellite image made his property look like a sprawling, asymmetrical conquest. I waited, the silence on the line stretching, until Maria's voice broke the tension, now sharp with disbelief. Ethan, I think I see it. The property next to his north boundary, it's a huge tract of industrial parkland owned by a shell corporation named Titan Infrastructure. And guess who the primary director of Titan Infrastructure is? Silas Thorne's nephew, who handles all his shell businesses. And what is Thorne building on that property? I asked, already knowing the answer. Maria's voice was barely a whisper. There are current active permits for the construction of a massive, state-of-the-art R&D facility, a huge, multi-story structure. But there's a problem with the design. The city planning notes specify a minimum setback requirement from the residential boundary. I closed my eyes, the pieces snapping together with terrifying clarity. And that residential boundary, it's Thorne's own estate, isn't it? Yes, Maria confirmed. They needed the R&D facility to be built right up against the residential zone for some reason. Maybe proprietary access, maybe utility linkage. But the city code prevented the design. To meet the setback, they had to shift the building's footprint. And shifting the footprint meant they had to move the north property line, I finished. They bought the Titan Infrastructure industrial land, but to build their facility as designed, they needed to slightly enlarge the residential zone to create the illusion of proper setback from the R&D structure. Exactly, Maria said, her excitement mounting. They are manipulating the zoning code. They needed to expand Thorne's residential estate just enough so the R&D facility next door could be classified as sufficiently set back from the new property line. This is a brilliant, multi-layered land grab designed to skirt city regulations. I inhaled sharply. So, if the facility is on the north side, what does that have to do with my backyard on the south side? The answer, when it came, was the final, devastating twist that changed everything. The reason, Ethan, Maria explained, her voice gaining a frantic edge, is that the R&D facility has to be fully isolated. It handles highly proprietary, likely classified, material. The city permit stipulated that the new construction on the north side, the R&D facility, must be linked to the main residential estate by a single, secure, underground conduit, a fiber optic backbone, utility access, and perhaps a service tunnel for proprietary reasons. This conduit must run fully beneath Thorne's own property, and crucially, it must follow the shortest, straightest, most efficient path. Okay, I said, trying to visualize the map. North property to the main house. Where does my land fit in? The shortest, straightest path from the north side of the estate to the main house, Maria revealed, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, runs diagonally through the entire property. But there's a problem. The enormous L-shaped swimming pool complex and the tennis courts are right in the way. They can't tunnel under the pool or disrupt the foundations of the main house without massive, costly delays and structural risk. My heart pounded with realization. I pulled up the aerial photo again and zoomed out. The main house was strategically located at the center-south end of his massive plot. The R&D facility was being built at the center-north end. The straight line was obstructed. But if the property boundary were to be slightly curved or reshaped, Maria continued, laying out the shocking truth, a new, shortest, straightest path emerges. A path that skirts the pool complex by running right through the strip of land where the back of your small house property currently sits. It wasn't just about expansion. It was about path efficiency. My $350,000 lot was the only way to lay down a critical, high-security utility conduit, the technological spine of the R&D facility, without demolishing Thorne's $20 million pool complex or incurring astronomical construction costs and permit delays. The land itself was worthless to him, but its precise geographical location made it the single most expensive piece of dirt in the entire county. I was holding a king's ransom in my hands, and the deadline was 45 minutes away. "Maria, I need you to call Gary back immediately. Tell him the $1.2 million offer is rejected. Tell him I know about the R&D facility, I know about the setback requirements, and I know that my backyard is the only clean path for their proprietary conduit. I am not selling the land. I am selling the right-of-way for their tunnel and the ability to continue their unpermitted construction without a stop work order from the city. What's the price, Ethan?" Maria's voice was shaky, sensing the monumental jump we were about to make. I took a deep breath. I thought about the difference between $1.2 million and the potential damage to Thorne's project, a multi-million-dollar R&D facility that must be operating on a strict timeline. I remembered paying 10 times the price for my first terrible investment years ago, a lesson in desperation. Thorne was desperate now. "The price," I said, my voice clear and firm, "is $3.5 million, and I want the title to be held in escrow within the next 30 minutes, or I call the City Planning Commission with the coordinates of the new mortar in the stone wall." There was silence on Maria's end, a heavy silence pregnant with disbelief and professional terror. "Ethan, that's almost 3 times the first offer. It's an extortionate figure. He might pull out on principle." "He won't," I countered, staring at the stone wall. "If they have the heavy machinery running underground, they're past the point of no return. Their internal deadline is far more important than the money. They need to close this deal today, now, before anyone else realizes they've been building illegally up against their own property line." I hung up, knowing I had just entered a high-stakes negotiation with one of the most ruthless men in the state. I paced the length of my tiny living room, sweating under the pressure, watching the clock tick toward 5 p.m. 15 minutes later, my phone rang. It wasn't Maria. It was an unknown number, and I knew instantly who it was. I answered on the second ring. "Mr. Kincaid, this is Gary. I've heard your revised proposal. It is profoundly insulting." His voice was devoid of emotion, a dangerous monotone. "With respect, Gary," I said, trying to keep my own voice steady, "I think you'll find it's merely market value for a strategic asset. The alternative is a stop work order, public scrutiny regarding the R&D facility's proximity to residential zoning, and a potential civil suit regarding the breach of permit on the perimeter of Mr. Thorne's estate. How much will that cost your client in lost time and restructuring fees?" A pause. A long, chilling pause. I could hear a distant clicking sound on his end, perhaps a pen tapping a desk. "Mr. Kincaid, the figure of $3.5 million is completely out of the question for a 700-square-foot residential plot. It's not about the square footage, Gary. It's about the shortest, straightest path for the conduit to bypass the pool and reach the main house. I'm selling the right-of-way for the tunnel that saves your client months of delay and millions in reconstruction. $3.5 million cash, no less. And the papers need to be drafted, signed, and the money in escrow before the original 5 p.m. deadline, or I call the city." I didn't blink. I had to project absolute confidence, even as my knees felt weak. I was betting my entire future on Silas Thorne's desperation and my ability to identify the one fatal flaw in his perfect plan. "The time is 4:40 p.m., Mr. Kincaid," Gary said, the monotone finally cracking into something sharp and dangerous. "You are playing a very risky game. I learned that lesson the hard way, Gary. I once paid 10 times the market price for a property because I was desperate. Your client is desperate now. You have 20 minutes. I hung up. I didn't wait for his reply, forcing his hand. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the clock on my stove, watching the seconds bleed away. 4:58 p.m. 2 minutes left. My phone was silent. I was starting to believe I had pushed too hard, that my desperation had eclipsed my judgment, and that I was about to lose the $1.2 million returning to the leaky faucet and the crippling mortgage. Then, at exactly 4:59 p.m., the phone rang. It was Maria. "Ethan, you are a lunatic," she gasped, her voice full of a giddy, relieved hysteria. "Gary just called. The funds, $3.5 million, are in escrow. The contract is drawn up. They've accepted the terms. They demand a signing immediately." I staggered backward, leaning against the wall for support. I had not only beaten them, but I had successfully analyzed the complexity of their scheme, leveraging their secret development plans against them. I found the hidden flaw in a billionaire's master plan and multiplied my initial offer by almost 3. I'd gone from almost broke to financially secure in 24 hours, all because I refused to sell the small house without understanding its true, hidden worth. The closing was surreal. 2 hours after Gary's reluctant acceptance, I was sitting across a mahogany table from him in a sterile, glass-walled conference room downtown. Maria was beside me, still beaming with incredulous pride. The air was thick with tension, punctuated by the rapid, controlled movements of the lawyers reviewing the final documents. Silas Thorne was not present, of course. His empire moved without his direct involvement, a testament to his power. But Gary, now stripped of his earlier corporate smugness, was a picture of tightly controlled fury. He didn't look at me once. He just focused on the papers, signing the transfer documents with a pen that looked unnecessarily expensive. The contract itself was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering. It wasn't a sale of the house, not exactly. It was a purchase of the easement, the permanent right-of-way for an underground conduit, plus a massive setback waiver on the remainder of the property, effectively giving them complete control over the strategic subsurface of my backyard. The small house itself was technically still mine, but the land beneath it, the crucial access point, belonged to Thorne forever. The $3.5 million was compensation for this permanent encumbrance. As Gary slid the final document across the table for my signature, he finally met my eyes. They were cold, flat, and hard. "You are resourceful, Mr. Kincaid," he said, his voice barely audible. "You identified the flaw, but never mistake luck for genius. Mr. Thorne will remember this transaction." I signed the papers without hesitation, my hand steady. "And I will remember the feeling of paying 10 times what something was worth, Gary." That's what taught me to recognize desperation. The money hit the escrow account before I even stood up. $3.5 million. It was done. I had won the high-stakes chess game against a billionaire's army of lawyers, not through insider knowledge or wealth, but through relentless suspicion and a basic understanding of property zoning. As I walked out of the office building with Maria, the world felt different. The light was brighter, the city sounds sharper. I was free. Maria immediately started celebrating, talking about exotic trips and retirement plans. But I felt a lingering unease. Gary's final comment echoed in my mind. "Mr. Thorne will remember this transaction." A week passed. I paid off the small house mortgage, cleared all my debts, and found a temporary furnished apartment near downtown. I was packing the last of my meager belongings from the small house, preparing to hand the keys over to a contractor who would begin the excavation for Thorne's conduit. The atmosphere in the little house felt heavy, like the silent presence of a massive, hidden operation underway just beyond the stone wall. I was in the attic, retrieving an old box of photos, when I found something I hadn't seen in years. An old, dusty, leather-bound journal that belonged to the man who built the small house back in the 1940s. A local, independent architect named Silas Thorne. I froze. Thorne. Could it be a coincidence? I opened the journal, the pages brittle with age, and began reading the elegant, faded script. Silas Thorne was Silas Thorne's grandfather. The journal detailed the construction of the main estate and, fascinatingly, the adjacent small house. Elias, the grandfather, hadn't built the small house for resale. He had built it for his younger brother, Thomas, a black sheep of the family who preferred simple living and independence to the gilded cage of the main estate. The small house was a familial act of separation, a place for Thomas to live adjacent to, but never truly within, the family compound. The critical information, however, came on the last few pages, dated 1947. Elias wrote about the construction of the stone wall and the peculiar shape of the property lines. He detailed how the land had been strategically split to exclude a single, very small, but crucial feature from the main estate, a feature that was then hidden within the boundary of the small house lot. The journal entry read, "To ensure Thomas's absolute independence, I drew the boundary to leave the natural artesian spring on his side of the property. The spring, though small, feeds the main cistern for the entire estate. If Silas ever tries to control Thomas, he will learn that the true source of water, the very lifeblood of the estate, is not in his dominion." My stomach dropped. The artesian spring. I had noticed a small, slightly mossy area near the stone wall, constantly damp, where the water pressure had always felt strangely strong. I had dismissed it as poor drainage. It wasn't poor drainage. It was the ancient, reliable, and secret water source for the main Thorne estate. I realized with chilling clarity why Silas Thorne didn't just want the shortest path for his conduit. He wanted the land back, all of it, for complete control. By purchasing the easement and setback waiver, he was claiming the subsurface rights, which almost certainly included the underground water source. The $3.5 million was not just for the right-of-way. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim the ultimate control lever over the estate, a lever his grandfather had deliberately put outside the main property boundary decades ago. I hadn't just sold an easement, I had unknowingly sold the Thorne family's primary water source. And I had charged them $3.5 million to reclaim the leverage that had been held against them for nearly a century. This was the true, deep value of the small house. And I had sold it for less than 10 times the original price, but still a monumental figure. But the twists weren't over. As I packed the journal, I noticed a final, tiny notation written in the margin next to the spring entry. It was dated much later, perhaps the 1980s, in Thomas's shaky handwriting. "The spring is clean, but the city connected a redundant emergency feed to the cistern from Willow Creek's main municipal line in '83. Silas can cut off the spring, but he can't cut off the water." My leverage had been based on a misconception. The spring was symbolic, historical, and valuable, but no longer the only lifeblood of the estate. I sat on the dusty floor of the small house, the journal open to that final tiny note, and felt a strange mix of relief and profound irony. The pressure I had exerted on Thorne, the threat of controlling his water supply, was largely empty. The redundancy line meant he would still have running water, regardless of the fate of the spring. The true power I wielded was not over his water, but over his construction timeline and regulatory compliance. That was the lever that had gotten me the $3.5 million. The spring was a massive symbolic cherry on top, but not the critical life or death asset his grandfather had intended it to be in the modern era. This realization, however, added a terrifying new dimension to Gary's final words. "Mr. Thorne will remember this transaction." If Thorne had discovered the note in the journal after the fact, if he realized I had charged him $3.5 million for an obsolete bargaining chip, the spring, packaged with a necessary utility easement, his anger would be personal and explosive. He wouldn't just be mad about the money, he'd be furious about the perceived historical sleight of hand. I quickly bundled up the journal, stuffing it into my backpack. I wasn't leaving it behind. It was too much of a liability, too much proof of the family's strange history and the manipulation of the land boundaries. The next morning, I officially handed the keys to the small house to a construction manager named Rex. He was a gruff man with a clipboard and absolutely no interest in me. "Just the keys, pal. We've got a tight schedule here," he grunted. "I'm just curious," I asked, trying to sound casual. "What exactly are you building down there? It seems like a lot of heavy machinery for a fiber optic cable." Rex barely paused, his eyes scanning the property boundary. "It's an exclusive utility corridor. High security specs. Needs to be deep and reinforced. We're breaking ground this afternoon. Your old backyard is going to be a trench within the hour." I nodded, trying to appear satisfied. Exclusive utility corridor. That fit the narrative. It hid the true purpose, the R&D facility's nervous system. I left the small house for the last time, but instead of driving away, I parked on a public street a block away and walked to the perimeter of Thorne's estate on the north side, the industrial zone Maria had identified. The Titan infrastructure property was a hive of activity. Construction noise echoed across the vast fenced-off lot. I could clearly see the foundation being poured for the new R&D facility. It was enormous, 3 stories high already, with deep underground levels visible from the sheer size of the cranes and excavation equipment. I walked the public sidewalk right up to the residential boundary line between the industrial park and Thorne's estate. This was the line they had manipulated the zoning codes to expand. They needed that critical setback space. As I stood there, watching the sheer scale of the operation, I realized the $3.5 million was probably less than 1% of the total cost of this development. Thorne could barely feel the loss. But the fact that a small-time homeowner had slowed him down and forced him to pay a premium on a non-negotiable asset, that was the insult. I returned to my temporary apartment, planning my next steps. I was rich, but paranoid. Thorne's threat felt real. I had a few days to get out of Willow Creek, sell my furniture, and vanish into my new life. Then, I got a registered letter delivered by a private courier. It wasn't from Gary. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize, specializing in corporate litigation. The letter was brief and professional, but the content made the blood drain from my face. It stated that the firm representing Silas Thorne was filing a civil suit against me for material misrepresentation and fraudulent concealment in the sale of the small house easement. The basis of the lawsuit was not the $3.5 million price tag itself, but a technicality within the complex easement agreement I had signed. The contract stipulated that I was selling the land without any known undisclosed liabilities or encumbrances. The lawsuit alleged that I had failed to disclose a major environmental encumbrance on the property. Specifically, they claimed the old, unsealed septic tank from the 1940s, which the small house still relied on, and which I had conveniently forgotten to mention during the frantic 24-hour closing, was a contamination hazard directly in the path of their new high-security utility corridor. The cleanup and remediation costs, they claimed, would run into the hundreds of thousands, delaying the project by weeks. And the total damages they were seeking? $5 million. They weren't just trying to get their $3.5 million back. They were trying to ruin me. They wanted to take every penny I had just earned and leave me with a massive debt, sending a clear, devastating message to anyone who dared to challenge Silas Thorne. This wasn't about the septic tank. It was about revenge. I immediately called Maria, panic thick in my throat. They're suing me. $5 million. The septic tank, I totally forgot about it. It was functional, but ancient. Did I really commit fraud? Maria remained calm. They are playing dirty, Ethan. It's not fraud. It's a standard non-disclosure issue and typically settled for small remediation costs. But they are weaponizing it. They know the septic tank is exactly where their conduit has to go. So what do we do? I pleaded. I can't fight Silas Thorne in court for months, maybe years. Maria paused. We fight fire with fire. We've got two things they don't want disclosed: the R&D facility's illegal zoning manipulation and the fact that you forced them to pay an astronomical price for an access point. We'll offer a settlement. They drop the suit, and we sign a non-disclosure agreement on the entire transaction and their R&D facility zoning. That's the best option. And if they refuse, then we go to war, Ethan. And we use the one piece of evidence we have that proves their true motive: the history of the property and the Thorne family's generations-long obsession with that specific land boundary. I looked at the backpack containing the old journal, my secret weapon. The history wasn't just interesting. It was proof of their desperate intent, a counter-narrative to their claim of my fraud. They were trying to punish me for the price I demanded, not the septic tank I concealed. I told Maria everything: the old man's journal, the artesian spring, the obsolete water contingency, and the realization that the $3.5 million wasn't for water, but for strategic access and a timeline buffer. This was the history I had accidentally leveraged. The septic tank, the centerpiece of Thorne's lawsuit, was a perfect geographical coincidence designed to hit the precise weak spot of the high-security conduit. He hadn't just sued me. He had surgically attacked the weakest point of my defense, using his construction plans as a guide. Maria listened, taking rapid notes. The spring and the journal change everything, Ethan. It proves intent. It proves the value was strategic and familial, not just commercial. His granduncle split the land to keep control away from the main house. Thorne paid $3.5 million to undo a nearly century-old act of defiance. The septic tank is a diversion, a way to punish you for uncovering his secret. So, what's our move? I asked. We file an aggressive counter-motion demanding discovery related to the unpermitted construction of the R&D facility and the zoning manipulation, Maria stated firmly. We won't mention the journal or the spring yet. We just show that we know their entire scheme, forcing their hand before this becomes public. The next 3 days were a blur of legal maneuvers. Maria filed the counter-motion, citing specific dates and permits relating to the Titan infrastructure property and the illegal manipulation of the residential setback boundary. We were signaling that we held the key to his entire multi-million-dollar R&D project. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Gary called Maria not with legal threats, but with a desperate plea for a meeting. The following afternoon, I found myself back in the same sterile conference room. But this time, the atmosphere was different. Gary wasn't smug. He was defeated. And this time, he wasn't alone. Sitting next to him was a tall, silver-haired man with eyes like chips of blue ice, Silas Thorne. Thorne didn't waste a second on preamble. He looked directly at me, his gaze searing. "Mr. Kincaid, you forced my hand. You extorted an astronomical price for a non-essential asset, and now you are leveraging a technicality about my commercial zoning. I will not have my operations jeopardized by a petty squabble over a derelict septic system." "Mr. Thorne," I replied, feeling the full weight of his power, but standing my ground. "I sold you the most strategic square footage in Willow Creek, and I charged you a market-appropriate rate for the incredible disruption my small house caused to your multi-million-dollar timeline. I failed to disclose an old septic tank, an oversight I am prepared to remediate. But your lawsuit is not about the septic tank. It's about revenge. It's about recovering the leverage your own grandfather ensured you would never have. I know about Silas Thorne and the artesian spring." The effect of my words was stunning. Thorne's controlled fury vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, terrifying shock. He shot a venomous glance at Gary, who paled instantly. The spring was the deepest, most personal wound. He knew then that I understood the generational conflict that led to the property being split. I had discovered the entire narrative of his land conquest. "Where did you get that information?" Thorne demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "From the history of the house you just bought the right-of-way for," I replied coolly. "You wanted to erase the historical slight, not just secure a path for a cable. The $3.5 million price was fair for that peace of mind. Your lawsuit is transparently malicious. I will drop my knowledge of your zoning violation and the family history of the spring, and the fact that the conduit is running directly through an undocumented water source, if you immediately drop your $5 million fraud claim and cover all our legal fees." Maria leaned in, adding the final legal layer. "Furthermore, Mr. Thorne, the settlement must include a comprehensive, enforceable non-disclosure agreement, NDA, that prevents either party from discussing the terms of the sale, the lawsuit, the R&D facility's location, or the history of the artesian spring, ever." Thorne sat back, considering the options. He had to choose between fighting a costly, messy public battle that would expose his illegal R&D zoning and his family's historical vulnerability, or silencing me forever. His ambition outweighed his pride. After 5 minutes of agonizing silence, Thorne pushed a new document across the table. It was the settlement agreement, pre-signed by his lawyers. "Sign the NDA, Mr. Kincaid. Take your money and disappear," he hissed. I signed the settlement and then the comprehensive NDA. In the end, I walked away with the $3.5 million intact, plus my legal fees covered. Thorne paid an exorbitant amount to secure the path for his secret conduit, regain the symbolic control over the ancestral land, and, most importantly, buy my silence. I had been pressured to sell the small house in 24 hours, only to discover I wasn't just selling a backyard, but the keystone to a billion-dollar corporate project and the key to a 70-year-old family secret. I had gone from fixing a leaky faucet to negotiating against a billionaire, and I won. I paid 10 times more for my first desperate investment, but I forced the billionaire to pay 10 times more than the land was worth for his most critical asset. The moral of the story was simple. Always know what you are selling. I left Willow Creek a few days later, not just a millionaire, but a survivor, having learned that the true value of any asset is measured not by its size, but by the desperation of the person who needs it most.